There is a specific quality to silence that only comes after a great mystery. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of subtraction. Of presence becoming absence. Of a name called into an empty room. The town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, first knew that silence after the early hours of December 25, 1945. It was a Christmas morning that should have been defined by laughter and discarded wrapping paper. Instead, it was defined by a smoking hole in the ground and 5 missing names. To this day, the Sodder case remains one of the most haunting anomalies in American history. Because according to the laws of physics, what happened that night shouldn't have been possible. George Sodder was a man of firm convictions. An Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking business in Fayetteville through sheer determination, he was the embodiment of the American dream. He and his wife, Jenny, had 10 children. 9 of whom were living in the family's large timber frame home in 1945. But George was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. He was a vocal critic of the political climate in his homeland, often engaging in heated debates with other members of the immigrant community. In a small town, these frictions didn't just stay at the dinner table. They followed him. In the months leading up to that Christmas, the atmosphere turned dark. A stranger appeared at the house, ostensibly looking for work, but instead pointed at the fuse box and warned George it would, cause a fire someday. George found this odd, as the wiring had recently been inspected and cleared. Then came the insurance salesman. When George refused to buy a policy, the man turned cold. He told George, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed." He specifically blamed George's dirty remarks about the political leadership in Italy. Christmas Eve was a night of celebration. The older children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, asked to stay up late to play with their new toys. Their parents agreed, provided the last ones up remembered to lock the doors and turn out the lights. 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang. Jenny answered it. A woman she didn't recognize asked for a name Jenny had never heard. In the background, she heard the clinking of glasses and high-pitched laughter. Jenny politely told her she had the wrong number and hung up. As she walked back to bed, she noticed the house was eerily open. The lights were still on. The curtains were not drawn. The front door was unlocked. She assumed the children had simply been careless in their excitement. She locked the door and went back to sleep. 1 a.m., a sharp thud hit the roof. Jenny woke briefly, heard something roll down the shingles, and then drifted back to sleep. 1:30 a.m., Jenny woke again, but this time, it was the smell. Smoke was curling into the bedroom. The fire moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. George and Jenny managed to escape with 4 of their children, the youngest, 2 of the oldest sons, and a daughter. But 5 remained upstairs. George tried to go back inside, but the staircase was already a wall of flame. This is where the night shifts from a tragedy to something much more calculated. George ran to the side of the house where he always kept a tall ladder. It was gone. It wasn't in the shed, it wasn't by the porch. It was eventually found hours later, discarded 75 feet away at the bottom of an embankment. Desperate, George ran to his 2 coal trucks. He intended to drive them against the house and use the height of the cabs to climb into the children's windows. Both trucks, which had been used successfully the day before, refused to start. It was as if the engines had been drowned or tampered with simultaneously. Jenny tried to call the fire department. The line was dead. While it was long assumed the fire burned the wires, it was later discovered the line had been cleanly cut at the top of a pole. A man was later identified and fined for the act, claiming he thought he was cutting the power, not the phone. But the question remains, why cut any lines at all during a fire? The fire department, hampered by the holiday and the lack of a working phone line, didn't arrive for 7 hours. By then, the house was a smoldering pit. The fire marshal, F.J. Morris, conducted a brief search. His conclusion was swift: the 5 children had perished in the blaze. But the Sodders didn't believe it. Here is the science that haunts the case: human bone does not simply disappear. To cremate a human body completely, to the point where no teeth, no skull fragments, and no vertebrae remain, requires a temperature of at least 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for 2 to 3 hours. The Sodder house was a wooden structure that burned for approximately 45 minutes before collapsing. When the family brought in a pathologist, the conclusion was chilling: in a 45-minute house fire, the skeletons of 5 children, especially the older ones with developed bone density, should have been clearly visible in the debris. There was nothing. In 1949, the family hired a private investigator and a pathologist to dig into the basement site. They found a few small objects: a dictionary, some coins, and a few pieces of bone. The family's hearts sank, thinking they finally had proof of death. But when the bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, the report came back with a shock: the bones were beef vertebrae. They were unburned and had likely been planted in the soil to lead the family to stop searching. As the years passed, reports began to surface. A waitress at a roadside stop 50 miles away claimed she served breakfast to 5 children matching the Sodders' descriptions the morning after the fire. They were accompanied by adults speaking Italian. Then came the year 1967. 22 years after the fire, an envelope arrived for Jenny. There was no return address, but it was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photo of a young man in his 20s. On the back, a cryptic note: Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illo boys. The facial structure, the ears, and the hair matched Louis perfectly. The Sodders hired another private investigator to go to Kentucky and find the man in the photo. That investigator vanished. He never sent a report, never returned George's calls, and was never seen by the family again. The Sodders never moved. They refused to rebuild on the site. Instead, they covered the basement with soil and planted a memorial garden. On the edge of the property, they erected a massive billboard. It featured the photos of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. It listed the facts of the case: the missing ladder, the cut wires, the tampered trucks. George Sodder passed away in 1969. He spent his final days staring at that billboard, waiting for a car to pull over with news. Jenny Sodder wore black every day for the rest of her life, 44 years of mourning. She She died in 1989, still convinced her children were out there. The Sodder case is not just a story of a fire. It is a story of a series of accidents that, when placed together, look like a calculation. The ladder moved. The engines failed. The wires cut. The bones missing. 5 children entered the night of December 25, 1945. The fire ended, but the silence never did. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved, a hole in history that no amount of earth can fill. If you found this deep dive meaningful, please give the video a like and subscribe with the bell on. It really helps keep these stories alive and bring more cases like this to light.